I walked away from my loveless marriage after 15 years. What I found on the other side changed everything. Hi, my name is Rachel Anderson, and I'm 40 years old. I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and this is my story. I spent the last 15 years in a marriage that was, well, anything but affectionate. It took me a while to realize that I was just going through the motions, but once I did, everything changed. I want to share my journey with you, from the moment I decided to end my marriage to how I rediscovered myself and found happiness outside of those traditional expectations society places on us. Buckle up, it's been a wild ride. It was just another Tuesday morning, or at least it seemed that way at first. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into my coffee mug. The silence between Steve and me was deafening, but somehow it had become so familiar over the years that I had grown numb to it. 15 years together, yet we had nothing to say to each other anymore. We had settled into a routine where our lives existed side by side, but not together. We went through the motions, work, dinner, sleep, like we were on autopilot, never questioning how we got here. I can't pinpoint exactly when things changed between us, but I know it happened slowly, like a slow leak in a boat you don't notice until you're drowning. There were no major fights, no dramatic revelations. We just stopped. Stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped caring. I'd convinced myself that this was normal. After all, who's still head over heels after 15 years of marriage, right? But that morning, something felt different. I couldn't shake the sense that life was passing me by while I sat in a marriage that had become more of a habit than a partnership. Steve didn't seem to notice my growing discomfort. He sipped his coffee in silence, eyes glued to his phone like always. I stared at him, waiting for a moment of recognition or a sign that he still saw me. But he didn't look up. In that moment, it hit me, I wasn't just invisible to him, I was invisible to myself. When had I stopped caring about my own happiness? When had I decided that this was all I deserved? I excused myself from the table and walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. My 40-year-old face had new lines I didn't remember earning, and my eyes, once bright with hope, looked dull. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I'd spent so many years trying to keep the peace in a marriage that lacked warmth, that I'd lost track of my own needs, dreams, and desires. I was a shell of the person I used to be, and that realization shook me to my core. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, my mind racing. Could I really keep living like this? Could I wake up every day, go through the same motions, and pretend everything was fine for another 15 years? The thought made me feel suffocated, like the walls were closing in. And that's when I knew, I couldn't do it. I couldn't keep lying to myself. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was just two people occupying the same space, disconnected and indifferent. The decision to leave wasn't one I made lightly. Divorce had always seemed like something that happened to other people, not me. I grew up believing in marriage as a lifelong commitment, something you fought for no matter what. But as I sat there in the bathroom, I realized I had been fighting for a marriage that no longer existed. I was clinging to an idea, not a reality. And that's when I decided, I need to leave. But even with that clarity, the fear crept in almost immediately. What would people say? I was 40, not exactly in the prime of life for a fresh start. What if I was making a huge mistake? What if I ended up more miserable on my own than I was with Steve? The doubts swirled in my head like a tornado, but deep down, I knew I had to trust myself. I hadn't been happy in years, and staying for the sake of appearances wasn't going to fix that. Breaking the news to Steve was awkward, to say the least. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times in my head, but when the moment came, the words stumbled out clumsily. "Steve, I think we need to talk," I started, my voice shaking. He looked up from his phone, startled. It was probably the most serious thing I'd said to him in months. "I don't think this is working anymore," I continued, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "We've been drifting apart for a long time, and I don't think we can fix it." To my surprise, he didn't argue. He didn't get angry or defensive. Instead, he just nodded. "Yeah, I know," he said quietly. "I've felt it too." His words confirmed what I already knew: we had both been silently unhappy for a long time. There was no big blowout, no dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet acceptance that we were better off apart than together. The rest of that conversation was a blur. We agreed to start the process of separating, to keep things as amicable as possible. We didn't have kids to worry about, which made things easier, but there was still a lot of emotion tied up in the life we had built together. Even though I knew this was the right decision, it didn't make it any less painful. 15 years of shared memories, holidays, and daily routines were hard to walk away from, even if they weren't fulfilling anymore. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Steve was in the guest room, and the house felt eerily quiet. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to cry. Not just for the end of my marriage, but for the years I had spent living in a fog, convincing myself that things would get better when I knew deep down they wouldn't. I cried for the woman I had lost along the way, the one who used to have big dreams and passions before life and marriage dulled her edges. But mixed in with the sadness was a sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of pretending everything was fine had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was done settling for less than I deserved. I was ready to start over, to find myself again, and to live a life that felt authentic to who I was. As I drifted off to sleep, a small flicker of hope began to take root in my heart. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what came next. Once I had made up my mind to leave, reality hit hard. You know, you hear about divorce, you see it in movies, but when it's your life, it's different. It feels like you're suddenly responsible for dismantling an entire life you've built. Everything from dividing up assets to talking about who gets what, it's overwhelming. But despite the fear and confusion, there was a deep sense of peace that kept me moving forward. I knew I was doing the right thing. The first big step was finding a lawyer. I remember feeling like an absolute wreck just searching online for divorce attorneys. Typing "divorce lawyer" into the search bar made it all feel real. A part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, somehow, this was all a bad dream, and I'd wake up to my life magically fixed. But the more I avoided taking that first step, the more trapped I felt. I had to face it. When I finally walked into that lawyer's office, it was like stepping into another world. A world where my marriage was about to be reduced to legal terms, assets, and agreements. The lawyer, a calm middle-aged woman named Teresa, was kind but businesslike. She had seen this 1,000 times before, but for me, this was my first time staring down the reality of the situation. We sat down to go over the basics. "So, you've been married for 15 years, Teresa started, flipping through my file. "Do you have children?" I shook my head. "No kids. It's just me and Steve." "Okay, that simplifies things a bit," she said, and that word, simplifies, stuck with me. It felt like my marriage was being boiled down to simple transactions, a checklist. On one hand, that made things easier, but on the other, it felt like the emotional weight of those years was being brushed aside. We weren't just dividing a house and bank accounts. We were untangling lives. Then came the conversation about the house. That was tough. We had bought our little place together a few years after getting married, thinking it would be the home where we'd grow old together. I had so many memories tied to that place. Our first holiday dinner as a couple, the countless quiet nights watching TV, and even the fights over the dumbest things. Now, the house was just another thing to be divided. Teresa walked me through the options: sell it and split the money or figure out who gets to stay. In the end, I decided to keep it. Steve agreed. It was the one thing I felt strongly about. If I was starting over, I wanted a piece of my old life to ground me. Maybe that wasn't the most practical decision, but it felt like the right one. Then came the bank accounts, retirement funds, and everything else that had been intertwined over the years. It felt so impersonal. These were things we had worked on together, decisions we had made side by side, and now it was all just a negotiation. Teresa kept things moving, explaining what I was entitled to and what Steve would likely agree to. And honestly, Steve wasn't difficult about any of it. The truth is, we both knew the marriage had been over for a long time. We were just finally putting it down on paper. As the legal process unfolded, there was this strange combination of sadness and relief. It was like peeling off a bandage, painful, but you know it's necessary. There were moments when I'd sit in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things we had once hoped for together. We had talked about traveling more, adopting a dog, maybe even having kids one day, though that idea faded quickly as the years went on. Now, those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else. The hardest part was not the division of assets, but the emotional toll it took. I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was saying goodbye to a version of myself I had lived with for 15 years. I didn't know what life would look like on the other side, and that was terrifying. But deep down, I knew staying would mean continuing to lose myself in a relationship that wasn't nurturing me. I had spent so much time focused on us, what we needed, what he wanted, that I had forgotten who I was. As we worked through the paperwork, there were times I wanted to back out, to go back to the safety of what I knew, even if it wasn't fulfilling. But every time I felt that tug, I reminded myself that this was my chance to find something better, not necessarily someone else, but a better version of myself. By the time we reached the final stages, Steve and I were barely talking, and that was okay. We didn't need to hash out the past or dig up old wounds. The relationship had died quietly, and now it was time to put it to rest. When the day came to finalize the divorce, there was no grand farewell, no dramatic moment. We both signed the papers, exchanged a few polite words, and that was it. Just like that, 15 years of marriage came to an end. It felt strange, like a weight had been lifted, but also like I was stepping into a void. I remember walking out of the courthouse, taking a deep breath, and feeling the sun on my face. I stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. The past was behind me now, and ahead was a blank page. As I got into my car, I felt a surge of both fear and hope. I didn't know exactly where my life was headed, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the power to shape it. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, I realized something. I had been afraid of being alone for so long, but now that I was here, it didn't feel as scary as I thought it would. It felt like freedom. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew that for the first time in years, I was living for myself. And that, I realized, was worth everything. After the divorce was finalized, I found myself in an unfamiliar place, a life that was mine alone to define. It was exciting but also terrifying. I had spent 15 years building my identity around being a wife, a partner in a marriage, and now that was gone. Who was I, really, outside of that relationship? The house felt emptier than ever, and so did I. But deep down, I knew that this emptiness wasn't just a void, it was an opportunity. It was the space I needed to rediscover myself. In the first few weeks, I floundered. I wasn't sure what to do with all the free time I suddenly had. For so long, my life had revolved around routines with Steve, cooking dinner, watching TV, making small talk. Now I had no one to answer to, no one to check in with. The silence was overwhelming. I could do whatever I wanted, but what did I want? I had no idea. One afternoon, I was cleaning out the garage, going through old boxes, and I came across something I hadn't seen in years, a sketchbook. Before I met Steve, I used to draw all the time. It had been one of my favorite hobbies in college, something I did to relax and express myself. But life, marriage, and responsibilities had pushed it to the back burner, and eventually, I forgot about it altogether. Seeing that sketchbook stirred something inside me, a small flicker of the person I used to be. I sat down right there on the cold garage floor, flipping through the pages. My old drawings weren't perfect, but they were mine. They were raw, unpolished, and full of emotion. I realized in that moment how much of myself I had left behind, not just the drawing, but everything that made me feel alive and connected to who I was. The next day, I went to an art supplies store and bought myself a brand new sketchbook and some pencils. It felt strange at first, like I was reconnecting with an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. But as soon as I started drawing again, the muscle memory kicked in, and it was like I'd never stopped. I spent hours sketching, losing myself in the lines and shading, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt at peace. It wasn't just about the art, it was about reclaiming a part of myself I had long forgotten. Rediscovering my love for drawing opened the door to other passions I had left behind. I started reading again, devouring books I had always wanted to read but never made time for. I joined a local book club, something I would have never done while I was married. Steve wasn't much of a reader, and I always felt like I had to adjust my interests to fit into our life together. Now, I didn't have to worry about that. I could immerse myself in whatever I wanted. Another thing I rediscovered was my love for the outdoors. When I was younger, I used to go on hikes and weekend camping trips with friends. Nature was my escape, my way of clearing my mind and finding balance. But over the years, I had let that part of myself fade, convincing myself that I was too busy to spend time outdoors. In reality, I had let my marriage consume all my free time. One Saturday, I decided to change that. I packed up a small backpack, laced up my old hiking boots, and drove to a nearby nature trail. I had forgotten how much I loved the smell of the trees, the sound of birds chirping, and the crunch of leaves under my feet. The hike was challenging, especially since I was out of practice, but it was exactly what I needed. As I climbed higher, feeling the burn in my legs and the sweat on my skin, I felt alive again. I wasn't just going through the motions, I was living. That day, standing at the top of the trail with a stunning view of the mountains before me, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let my divorce define me. I wasn't going to be the woman who got divorced after 15 years. No, I was going to be the woman who found herself again after 15 years. The woman who rediscovered her passions, pursued her dreams, and embraced the freedom that came with starting over. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when I felt lost, days when the loneliness crept in, and I questioned if I had made the right decision. But those days became fewer and farther between as I filled my life with things that made me happy. I started going to pottery classes, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the chance. I wasn't great at it, but that didn't matter. It was about the process, the creativity, and the simple joy of working with my hands. I also reconnected with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my marriage. Some of them were surprised to hear about the divorce, but they were supportive. It felt good to rebuild those relationships, to have people in my life who knew me before I became Mrs. Anderson. They reminded me of who I was before the marriage, and they encouraged me to keep moving forward, even on the tough days. The more I allowed myself to explore these old and new passions, the more I began to see my life as my own again. It was no longer about what I was supposed to do or who I was supposed to be for someone else. It was about what made me feel fulfilled, what made me feel alive. And in that process, I found something unexpected. I found myself. The woman I had been before the marriage wasn't lost after all. She had just been buried under years of compromises, expectations, and routines. But now, she was re-emerging, stronger, more self-assured, and ready to take on the world. After my divorce, the first wave of freedom felt exhilarating. I was rediscovering who I was, reconnecting with old passions, and finally living life for myself. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something I hadn't anticipated: judgment. Not just from others, but from myself. Divorce, especially for someone in their 40s, comes with an invisible stigma. You're expected to have your life figured out by then, and stepping away from a long-term marriage is seen as a failure in many people's eyes. In the beginning, I thought I didn't care what anyone thought. I was doing what was right for me, and that's what mattered. But as the news of my divorce spread through our social circles, the whispers started. Friends I had known for years would ask subtle, probing questions. Are you sure this is what you want? Did you really try to make it work? Even the ones who meant well couldn't help but let their curiosity or concern slip through. It's amazing how people feel entitled to an opinion about your life, especially when it comes to something as personal as marriage. At first, I brushed it off. But as the weeks went by, the weight of those judgments began to seep in. It wasn't just my close friends. I could see the way acquaintances and colleagues looked at me differently. There was a shift, like I had become the divorced woman, no longer fitting into the neat, married woman box I had once occupied. It's funny, because Steve and I hadn't been truly happy in years, but to the outside world, we still fit the mold of what a successful couple looked like. The moment I stepped out of that mold, people didn't know how to treat me anymore. The hardest part wasn't even the judgment from others, it was the judgment I put on myself. I had always been a bit of a perfectionist, someone who liked to do things the right way. Marriage was supposed to be one of those things I got right. You grow up being told that marriage is forever, and when it isn't, you start to wonder if you failed. I spent so much time trying to make things work, and when it didn't, I couldn't help but question myself. Had I given up too soon? Could I have done something different? Was I just not cut out for marriage? One day, I met up with a friend I hadn't seen in a while, Lisa. She had been through a divorce a few years earlier, so I figured she'd understand where I was coming from. Over coffee, I poured my heart out, talking about how I felt judged and guilty. I was afraid people were seeing me as a failure, and, worse, that I was seeing myself that way. Lisa listened patiently, nodding in understanding. When I finished, she leaned in and said something that stuck with me: "Rachel, divorce isn't a failure. Staying in a marriage where you're miserable, that would have been the failure. You had the courage to leave a situation that wasn't serving you. That's not failure. That's strength." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. She was right. I had spent so long internalizing this idea that divorce meant I had failed, but in reality, it was the opposite. I had made the brave choice to walk away from something that was no longer working, not just for me, but for Steve too. We both deserved more than a half-lived life in a marriage that had run its course. And that wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. After that conversation, something shifted in me. I stopped caring so much about what other people thought. I realized that their judgments were more about them than about me. People love to project their own fears and insecurities onto others, especially when it comes to things like relationships. The truth was, most of the people who were judging me had no idea what my marriage was really like. They didn't know the years of emotional distance, the nights spent in silence, the loneliness that came with being with someone who no longer saw you. And that's when I realized, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. My life was mine to live, and no one else's opinion could change that. I had already lived too many years trying to fit into the mold of what a wife was supposed to be. Now, I was breaking out of that mold, and it was freeing. I also started to notice something else. As I began to embrace my new identity as a divorced woman, other people's reactions became less important. The more I stood confidently in my decision, the less their opinions mattered. Sure, there were still awkward moments at dinner parties when someone would ask, "Where's Steve?" and I'd have to explain that we had split. But over time, those conversations became easier. I didn't feel the need to justify myself anymore. I had made the best decision for me, and that was enough. The turning point came when I ran into an old acquaintance, Karen, at the grocery store. Karen was one of those people who always seemed to have it all together: perfect husband, perfect kids, perfect life. As we exchanged pleasantries, she asked how Steve was. When I told her we had divorced, she gave me that "oh, I'm so sorry" look, the one that drips with pity. I used to dread those moments, but this time, I didn't flinch. I smiled and said, "Yeah, it was the best decision I've ever made. I'm really happy now." And that was it. No explanation, no justification. Just the truth. Karen seemed surprised by my response, but she nodded and quickly changed the subject. As I walked away, I realized something important: other people's judgments lose their power when you stop internalizing them. The only person who gets to decide if my life is successful or not is me. The more I embraced that mindset, the more confident I became in my choices. I didn't have to live up to anyone else's expectations. I didn't have to be the perfect wife or fit into anyone's idea of what a good marriage looked like. I just had to live my life authentically, and that meant letting go of the fear of judgment. In the end, facing the judgment of others taught me one of the most important lessons of my journey: the only person I need to please is myself. Once I embraced that truth, the weight of other people's opinions fell away, and I felt lighter than I had in years. As I became more comfortable with my decision to divorce and learned to let go of the judgment from others, I started to focus on something I hadn't done in years: dreaming. I mean, truly allowing myself to think about what I wanted my life to look like. Not just the next year or two, but the big picture. I realized I had been so consumed with trying to fix my marriage and maintain a life that looked good from the outside that I had completely neglected my own desires. Now that I was free from that, the world felt open again. It was both exhilarating and a little overwhelming. Where do you even begin when you're starting from scratch at 40? I knew I didn't want to fall into the trap of just filling my life with distractions. I wanted to build something real, something that made me excited to get out of bed in the morning. One of the first things I did was reconnect with an old passion that I had abandoned long ago: photography. Before Steve and I got married, I used to spend hours wandering through the city with my camera, capturing little moments of life. I loved the way photography forced me to slow down and really see the world around me. But somewhere along the way, between work, marriage, and just life in general, I stopped. My camera had been sitting in the back of a closet for years, collecting dust. One afternoon, I pulled it out, cleaned it off, and decided to take it with me on a walk through my neighborhood. At first, it felt strange, like I was trying to fit into an old pair of shoes that no longer quite worked. But as I wandered down the familiar streets, snapping pictures of the trees, the kids playing in the park, and even the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, something inside me began to awaken. I spent hours that day just walking and photographing, losing track of time. By the time I got home, I felt a kind of joy I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't about the photos themselves, it was about the process of rediscovering something I loved. It reminded me that I still had so much life left to live and that it was up to me to decide what that life looked like. From that day on, I made photography a regular part of my life again. I even signed up for a local photography class, which turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd made since the divorce. The class wasn't just about learning new techniques, it was about meeting new people who shared my interests. I started to build a community around myself that had nothing to do with my old life, and that felt incredibly liberating. But photography wasn't the only thing I rediscovered. As I began to explore my passions, I realized that I had dreams I had never allowed myself to fully acknowledge. One of those dreams was starting my own business. I had always been passionate about helping people, and the idea of creating something from the ground up excited me. For years, I had worked in an office, doing work that was fine but not fulfilling. I had always played it safe because that's what was expected of me. Now, I didn't have to play it safe anymore. I started brainstorming ideas for what kind of business I could start. At first, I wasn't sure. Should I go into photography professionally? Should I open a small shop or a cafe? The possibilities were endless, and that in itself was freeing. After a lot of thought, I decided I wanted to start a business that helped other women who were going through transitions in their lives, whether it was divorce, career changes, or just feeling stuck like I had been. I wanted to create a space where women could come together, find support, and rediscover their own passions. The idea felt a little crazy at first. I had never run a business before, and I had no idea where to start. But I knew one thing, I was passionate about it. And after years of putting everyone else's needs before my own, it felt amazing to finally be pursuing something that was entirely mine. I started small, offering workshops and one-on-one coaching sessions with women in my community. Before I knew it, my little side project started to grow. I was helping women rebuild their lives after big transitions, just like I was doing for myself. It wasn't just about the business. It was about the way it made me feel. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something that had the potential to change lives, including my own. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was actively creating the life I wanted, and that was a powerful realization. Of course, there were still challenges. Starting a business is hard work, and there were plenty of days when I wondered if I was in over my head. But every time I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself why I was doing this. I was no longer living a life dictated by someone else's expectations. I was living a life that was true to who I was. And that made all the difference. As I built my business, I also found myself reconnecting with other parts of my life that I had neglected for too long. I started traveling again, something Steve and I had always talked about but never actually did. I took trips on my own, visiting places I had always wanted to see but never made time for. Each new destination felt like a new chapter in my life, a chance to explore not just the world, but who I was becoming. I also made more time for the people who mattered most to me. I had drifted away from some of my closest friends during my marriage, but now I had the time and energy to invest in those relationships again. I spent more weekends with my family, catching up on years of missed connections. It felt good to rebuild those bonds and to be surrounded by people who supported me unconditionally. The more I pursued my passions and dreams, the more I realized that divorce wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new one. I wasn't defined by my marriage or my divorce. I was defined by the choices I made moving forward, and I was choosing to live a life that was rich with meaning, passion, and joy. The dreams I had pushed aside for so long were finally coming to the forefront, and I wasn't afraid to chase them. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly living, not just surviving. And that realization filled me with hope for the future. The day I finalized my divorce felt like the end of an era. But now, looking back, I see that it wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. I had spent 15 years in a marriage that had quietly drained me of my joy, my passion, and my sense of self. And while walking away from that life was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, it was also the most freeing. It was the decision that allowed me to begin again. Now, 3 years later, my life is completely different, and in the best possible way. I've rediscovered the parts of myself I thought I'd lost, built a career that I'm proud of, and filled my life with new experiences, relationships, and adventures. I've learned that happiness doesn't come from living the life other people expect you to live, it comes from creating a life that feels true to who you are. I'd be lying if I said the journey was easy. There were days when I questioned everything, when the loneliness felt overwhelming, and when the weight of starting over seemed too heavy to bear. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself why I had made the decision to leave in the first place. I wasn't just leaving a marriage, I was leaving behind a life that no longer served me. The process of starting over was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges I hadn't anticipated. But it was also the most empowering experience of my life. I realized that I was stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. I had spent years convincing myself that staying in my marriage was the safe choice, the right choice. But in reality, it was holding me back from living a full, authentic life. Walking away was scary, but it was the only way I could make space for the life I truly wanted. As I built my new life, I also learned to let go of the idea that there was a right way to live. For so long, I had measured my success by other people's standards, marriage, career, stability. But what I've come to realize is that success looks different for everyone. For me, success wasn't about staying in a relationship for the sake of appearances or following a traditional path. It was about finding joy, fulfillment, and peace within myself. One of the biggest lessons I've learned through all of this is the power of self-compassion. It's easy to be hard on yourself after a divorce, to second-guess every decision you made and wonder if things could have been different. But I've come to understand that self-compassion is key to moving forward. I had to forgive myself for the mistakes I made and the time I lost trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. I had to let go of the guilt and the what-ifs and focus on the future instead of the past. As the months passed, I began to see that starting over wasn't just about rebuilding my life, it was about redefining who I was. I wasn't just Rachel, the divorced woman. I was Rachel, the woman who rediscovered her passion for photography, who started her own business, who traveled to places she had always dreamed of visiting, and who built a community of friends and supporters who lifted her up. I also realized that I didn't need a partner to feel complete. For so long, I had believed that being in a relationship was the key to happiness and fulfillment. But after my divorce, I learned to enjoy my own company. I embraced the solitude, finding peace in the quiet moments and learning to love myself in a way I never had before. That self-love was the foundation upon which I built my new life, and it allowed me to move forward with confidence, knowing that I was enough just as I was. That doesn't mean I've sworn off relationships altogether. But I've learned to approach them differently now. I no longer feel the need to settle for something that doesn't serve me, and I'm not afraid to walk away from anything or anyone that doesn't align with my values or my vision for my life. I've come to understand that a healthy relationship should enhance your life, not define it. And if a relationship doesn't support my growth and happiness, then it's not the right one for me. As for my ex-husband, Steve, we're not in each other's lives anymore, and that's okay. There's no bad blood between us, no lingering resentment. We've both moved on, and I genuinely hope he's found his own happiness. Our marriage may have ended, but it wasn't a failure. It was a chapter in my life that taught me valuable lessons about myself, about love, and about what I want from the future. And for that, I'm grateful. The truth is, I've come to see my divorce not as an ending, but as a necessary step toward becoming the person I'm meant to be. It's opened up doors I never would have walked through if I had stayed in that marriage. It's given me the courage to pursue my dreams, to live authentically, and to embrace the unknown with an open heart. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I feel a sense of excitement about the day ahead. My life is no longer defined by someone else's expectations, and that's the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. I've learned that it's never too late to start over, and it's never too late to create the life you've always wanted. As I stand here now, 3 years after my divorce, I feel more like myself than I ever have. I'm proud of the person I've become, and I'm excited for whatever the future holds. I know there will be challenges, as there always are, but I also know that I have the strength, resilience, and determination to face them head-on. After all, I've already done the hardest thing I've ever had to do, walk away from a life that wasn't right for me. And because of that, I know I can handle whatever comes next. This new beginning isn't just a second chance, it's the life I was always meant to live. And I can't wait to see where it takes me. Lessons learned from the Bible's point of view. The story of Rachel's journey teaches us valuable lessons about resilience, rediscovery, and the pursuit of true happiness, all of which align with teachings from the Bible. In Rachel's decision to leave a loveless marriage, we are reminded of how important it is to seek a life that reflects the fullness of God's purpose for us. Though divorce is a painful experience, the Bible provides insight into the sanctity of relationships, personal growth, and healing. One of the first lessons we can learn is the importance of self-awareness and recognizing when something no longer serves us, as reflected in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, "To everything, there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." Rachel realized her season in a marriage that lacked love and affection had come to an end. This teaches us that God intends for us to experience seasons of growth, and it is okay to acknowledge when one season has passed, allowing a new one to begin. Next, Rachel's story highlights the importance of personal identity and purpose, which echoes Jeremiah 29 verse 11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Just as Rachel rediscovered her old passions and dreams, we are reminded that God's plans for us are filled with hope and purpose. God calls us to live fully, using the talents and passions He's placed in our hearts. When Rachel reignited her love for pottery and photography, she was, in fact, aligning herself with God's greater purpose for her life. Moreover, Rachel's courage to step away from societal expectations and pursue happiness reminds us of Romans 12 verse 2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Society often dictates what we should or shouldn't do, but God urges us to seek His will rather than conforming to human expectations. Rachel's story teaches us that, while divorce is challenging and often comes with judgment, we should look to God's guidance for peace, not the opinions of others. Her story also illustrates the value of community and support, as reflected in Proverbs 27 verse 17, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." Surrounding herself with supportive friends who encouraged her during her transition was essential for Rachel's healing. It's a reminder that God places people in our lives to help strengthen and encourage us during difficult seasons. Lastly, Rachel's rediscovery of happiness and contentment shows us that joy and fulfillment come from within, as taught in Philippians 4 verse 11, "I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances." Even in her solitude, Rachel found peace and joy. This aligns with the biblical principle that true contentment is found in our relationship with God, not in external circumstances. In conclusion, Rachel's story illustrates that while divorce may be a painful chapter, it can also lead to growth, healing, and a renewed sense of purpose.